Okay, great. And when we're doing it online, I can see them on the screen.
Check. Am I audible? Am I audible to the participants online? Good afternoon, everyone. Please take a seat first for everyone. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. First, let me introduce myself. I am Tasha Nabila Edlian, as a fourth-year medical student from Pajajaran University, same like all of you here. And today, I will become your master of ceremony. A warm welcome to all of you to join the guest lecture today. This lecture is aimed to facilitate all of you to understand more about the bioethics and the urgencies for clinical practitioner and medical students to understand more about bioethics. Today's theme is what is bioethics and why is it important to clinical practice and medical education. We will have a very special guest today's lecture, far away from Texas University at Austin, United States of America, Professor Benjamin Gregg. Professor Benjamin Gregg teaches social and political theory, as well as bioethics informed by philosophy, sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, but also teach in Germany, Austria, Sweden, Japan, China, and Brazil. He studied with Michael Walzer in Princeton, Axel Honneth in Berlin, and Sheila Benhabit in Yale. In addition to more than 80 sole author articles, he is the author of Constructing Human Nature, the first one, The Political Challenge of Genetic Engineering, Cambridge 2022, The Human Rights States, Pennsylvania 2016, The Human Rights as Social Construction, Cambridge 2012, Thick Moralities, Teen Politics, Duke 2003, Coping in Politics with Indeterminate Norms, New York 2003. His work has been translated into German, Portuguese, Italian, Japanese, and Chinese. Our research person today has a very extraordinary background. Therefore, please pay attention to this session carefully and seize the opportunity and ask several questions at the question and answer section. We would like to invite to the podium to deliver the lecture. Please welcome Professor Benjamin Gregg. Okay, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor for all of us. Moving on to the next session without any longer, Professor Gregg, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's so impressive to see so many of you here during a holiday. You could be outside enjoying the weather, having some tea, listening to K-pop. Instead, you have come to listen to me. Technology is always surprising, isn't it? I won't sound as nice as K-pop, I'm sorry, but I hope to interest you in an aspect really of your future life. I understand you are medical students and you study many technical things, science.
I'm sorry, Professor Gregg, you're not audible to the online participants. Can you move to the microphone closer?
What should I? Too close? Farther away. angle. And closer to my mouth. I can almost eat it. Okay. So I just want to say that you spend a great deal of time studying technical subjects, and I'm going to speak to you today on something that's somewhat more theoretical, but it's also very important for your life as physicians. Change the slide. Slide. So I'm going to make 4 arguments today. I tell you in advance so that you can know where we are at any given time. First, I'm going to define this term bioethics. What is bioethics? And then I'm going to talk about the relationship between medical practice, your future, and culture, cultural commitments. And then I'm going to show why bioethics is important to medical doctors, and finally, why bioethics is important to medical education. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm doing actually is a kind of propaganda. I'm trying to persuade you that my field is important. And I will try to give you some good reasons that resonate with you as students of medicine. Slide. Bioethics. It's an ethical theory. That means it is not natural science. It is not natural science. It is a theory. It's a theory about how physicians should treat medical patients and research subjects, not with regard to the narrowly medical concerns, but with respect to some ethical concerns. Slide. So there is no agreed upon definition of bioethics. There are competing notions. To be sure, different notions do agree on some aspects. For example, and this is very important for medical practice, there is agreement on the idea of informed consent. That is, no adult should receive medical treatment without his or her informed understanding. She knows what it involves and she agrees to the medical understanding. If she doesn't, the doctor should not treat her. This is an adult, not a child. But other understandings of, or other points in medical and bioethics do differ. Slide. Let me give you several examples. And the fact that there are different understandings of bioethics is, in fact, directly relevant to why bioethics is important in medical practice. I would say again that bioethics is not natural science, it is an ethical theory. A natural scientific theory would be, for example, Darwin's theory of evolution. Bioethics is not like that. Bioethics does not make empirical claims, it makes cultural claims. It makes cultural claims about the moral status of human beings. Now, human beings are, on the one hand, a naturally evolved organism, like all life on our planet. And from the standpoint of natural science, natural phenomena are not the sort of things that can have a moral status. I mean, A rock doesn't have a moral status, a piece of wood. But we might even think that many life forms, do plants have a moral status? Generally, it's not accorded one. Perhaps sometimes a few mammals are. Bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, maybe dolphins, are organisms of such high intelligence that humans are inclined to give them a certain status. If you do experiments on animals, you're much more likely to experiment on a mouse than on a chimpanzee. Not only because chimpanzees are much more expensive, but we regard them as more valuable, in a moral sense even. But that's not a natural scientific claim, that is a cultural claim. Slide. Moral status is something that humans do. Humans assign moral status. It's a capacity to create culture. It's not self-evident for the larger part of human history. Different civilizations and cultures have practiced, for example, slavery. Slavery is a way to treat someone as if they have no moral status. If a slave, by definition, is a human being that has the status of an object, like a chair or a table. A slave has no moral status. I'm not saying inherently, I'm saying from a cultural perspective. Today, we don't do slavery because we have persuaded ourselves around the world that all human beings have a moral status, that slavery treats a human being not as a moral being, but merely as an object. And we reject that viewpoint. In other words, culture creates meanings. And one of the meanings that cultures create are answers to a very old question. What are we, human beings? We have a lot of different theories and notions. To answer the question, what are we as human beings, is to answer a very, very important question, again, relevant to medicine, namely, how should we treat human beings? If we object to slavery, we're saying, do not treat a human being as my instrument, the way I treat a screwdriver, for example. And one way that human culture gives meaning, cultural meaning, to humans is to say that humans have a moral value or a moral status. And when a culture says that, it's not simply one person speaking. No, it means that within a community, people have a responsibility to behave in accordance with this status. Again, we don't practice slavery because we are freely persuaded that slavery is incompatible with the moral status of a person. Someone who does enslave another person has committed a crime. It's punishable. And to say that a human being has a moral status doesn't yet tell us exactly what and why. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. It does tell us that we treat a person as someone who can have legitimate interests of their own, right? If you have a slave, you tell the slave what to do, where to go, and so on and so forth. But a person with moral status has some capacity to decide for him or herself. And to have legitimate interests means that you have rights, certain rights that others should recognize. You are all young and so beautiful and perhaps unmarried. I'm a married man. I'm not making any suggestions here. I'm just saying that, for example, marriage is, today, we think of marriage as a free decision by two people, that no one can be coerced into marriage, that you can marry or not marry. It's your choice. And that you have a right to choose your partner. And if you have a bad relationship, you have a right to leave that relationship. That is one way of saying that humans have a moral status. Slide. What no one agrees about is why give humans a moral status? There are many reasons. One would be, in this large country of, 250 million people on 17,000 islands, majority Muslim. Well, all these great religions will all, excuse me, I had a frog for lunch and he's trying to say something. Religions such as Islam will say that humans have a moral status. That's one theory. Another version says that human status comes from our capacity for rationality. Other animals can reason, but not as well as we. Although animals that can reason as well as a bonobo or a chimpanzee, we think, well, then they share something with us and we give them a higher status. But no one says that about a cockroach. Well, cockroaches are interesting creatures. They've been around for a very long time. And humans, if they're really stupid, may destroy all life on Earth by nuclear weapons, but the cockroach will survive. Now, another version says that maybe humans have a moral status because humans have a capacity for feeling or sensation. It could be pleasure, it could be pain, but it could be other sensations. Again, at your lovely and tender age, maybe some of you are experiencing the pangs of love for another person. That's a profound phenomenon. And that one might say, well, that's a reason to have a moral status, right? I mean, if you look in your refrigerator, your carrot is not falling in love with the soybeans. A third version says that the moral status of a human might come from our membership in our species. At the level of species, you and I and all humans are identical. You can take the DNA of any human being on Earth, and that DNA will equally represent our entire species as any other person's. No human is more human or less human than any other human. In that sense, we might recognize a moral value in our species membership. But those are all theories. Slide. Now I'm coming to the most important distinction in my talk today, and I'm going to use this distinction again and again. And it's a simple distinction, but it has depths. Two things: nature and culture. Nature and culture. Let me explain. Well, think of us as humans. We are both nature and culture. We are evolved organisms, like all life on this planet, on the one hand. On the other hand, we are cultural. For example, one of the greatest creations of humankind, surely, is language. Language is profound. With language, we can have history. Cats and dogs don't have history. They have the same life. And every generation of cats is the same as every other generation. And they don't record, back there in Egypt, life used to be this, that, or so forth. But humans have a history. And humans can expand. You don't need to go to the moon to know about the moon, and so forth. Now, language has some biological bases. FOXP2 gene, for example. We have to have a structure to make language, our throats, our tongues, and so forth. But, and this is very important, these physiological characteristics do not imply any language. You could have these features and not have language. Presumably, our species, for a very long time, had no language. And when we do have languages, we have lots of them. We have many languages that have come and gone. We have about 7,000 today. They keep decreasing. Imagine Indonesia with all these islands. How many languages? I think already you have at least 200 today. I bet if you went to the year 1900, you probably had 2,000. The point is, no particular language follows from our biology. But is it not the case that when we think of what we are as humans, we think of course we are our bodies, but we are also our culture? That is my first of many examples of this combination of culture and nature. And my argument will be, you, ladies and gentlemen, as future physicians, also must always think about bringing these two categories together and why that is often difficult from the standpoint of bioethics. Notice also a political dimension, and by politics here, I don't mean everyday politics, but in a very narrow sense of the reasons that we really need to agree to make things happen. If you're driving in Indonesia, you're driving along and you come to a light, right? If it's red, you stop. If it's green, you go. It doesn't really matter what color, just as long as everyone agrees. If you had no street lights, it would be dangerous. Or if everybody had their own interpretation, it would be dangerous. But if everyone agrees, stop, red, go, green, we have safer driving procedures, for example. Now, that's a convention, and that's kind of a silly example, but let me give you a more profound example. And that is, we humans can agree on propositions about nature. Question: the Earth, does it revolve around the Earth? Does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the Earth? You know the answer. Great. You're going to be great doctors one day. Of course, ancient peoples thought it was the other way around, right? The sun comes up and goes down and so forth. But my point is this. That question, it has one answer, and only one answer. And that answer has nothing to do with culture. It was people like Galileo in Italy, and other Copernicus in Poland, and other scientists who were able to provide ultimately empirical evidence for this proposition. But that does not mean that this proposition is Polish or German or Italian or European. If the proposition is true, it is independent of culture. That's natural science. And we can agree. When you study physics, chemistry, biology, you study exactly what everyone else studies when they study these subjects. Here in Indonesia, in Bandung, they really do study the same physics and biology and chemistry, not only in Jogja, but in South Africa and in Vietnam and in Jordan and in Alaska and in Brazil, because there's only one biology, only one chemistry. So again, a true proposition in natural science, and medicine is in part natural science, a true proposition in natural science is true independent of culture. Slide. Are we on 11? I just want to be sure. Now, bioethics is different. Bioethics is not natural science. It's not objective in the way that natural sciences, no system of ethics is. Or at least we don't have any agreed upon ethics for the whole world. And even within ethical systems, we have disagreements. Islam, for example, is a great religion, but I think the understanding of Islam is different in Indonesia than it is in Saudi Arabia, for example. This is true of Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism. Now, we are strongly affected by our natural scientific knowledge because it's objective and we can do things with it. We can build an airplane and so forth. But you don't knowledge does not need to be objective in order to be important for humans and to have an effect on humans. If non-scientific knowledge is going to affect us, it does have to be intersubjective. In other words, it can't be subjective, one person saying, this is what's true. It has to be intersubjective, which means many people have to agree on it for it to have an effect. Ladies and gentlemen, look around you in this room right now, and I ask you, in fact, let me try this. If you are female, please raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're female. Thank you. I just demonstrated to you a remarkable aspect of cultural agreement. Because we are sitting at a university, a place of education, and women in all civilizations have been systematically excluded from higher education for most of history. In Europe, the oldest university is Bologna in northern Italy, 1,000 years ago. Yeah. Women didn't start attending universities in the West until the 20th century, and the large numbers only after World War II. That was self-evident. But today, if I were to walk into a classroom at UNPAD and all of the students were male, I would say, now that is strange. Why is that? Where are the women? My point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have changed our, in this case, intersubjective agreement. Why? What have we changed? We have persuaded ourselves against so much human history that men and women are equal, or morally equal, that should be treated as equal, that access to precious things like education should be accessible to women as well as men. And women, I have to say, Indonesian women in particular, are so smart. Why? Because now they dominate in your faculty of kedokteran, right? There are more women than men. They are really taking advantage of this wonderful opportunity. Both it's a wonderful opportunity for an individual to serve as a physician, but it's a wonderful part of society to help people with this most profound phenomenon, our bodies. And so only, but the claim that men and women are equal, that's not a natural scientific claim. It's a cultural claim. And the consequences are profound. Now again, I'm gonna always differentiate between culture and nature and talk about bringing them together in the study of medicine and the practice of medicine. Slide. Indeed, social stability and social cooperation require a lot of agreement. We disagree on many things, but our societies would be absolutely impossible if we didn't have actually significant amounts of agreement. You couldn't have, for example, if women have access to the university, they have access to all departments, all faculties. You can't say, oh yes, all women can be doctors, but they can't be engineers or mathematicians. The agreement is if women and men are equal and should have equal access, this has to be true throughout the university. And it can't be true just for the university, it has to be true for the legal system, the political system, the economic system. Slide. So what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that social stability and social cooperation, the very possibility of having a society, requires agreement specifically on guidelines about how to behave. How do we behave? And where do these guidelines come from? Again, there are various theories, but from a social scientific standpoint, we give them to ourselves. We create them. As you know, Indonesia was occupied by Dutch colonialists for 350 years. I shouldn't say Indonesia, but the archipelago, this part of the archipelago. The British were up north, as you know. Is Malaysia north or west? West, yeah. And the European colonialists dominated the peoples of these islands and assigned these peoples an inferior status. And the Europeans took valuable resources, cloves, other spices, gold, and so forth, back to Europe for the benefit of Europeans. I came from the teaching hospital of the university this morning. Lovely big building. It was built by the Dutch, for the Dutch. That hospital was not built for the people who lived in this country. It was built by foreigners for foreigners. Now, my point is that was the mentality in part, but that is unacceptable. Certainly as of 1945, Merdeka, independence, it took the Dutch a little, they had a little difficult understanding this, I know, a couple of years. But the point is, the understanding is, we are a people that belongs together. We are a nation, and we should control our own destiny. That is the understanding of the Indonesian, of the people in these islands today. It was not the understanding 100 years ago. And that means that foreigners cannot be superior to Indonesians. If anything, Indonesians have rights that foreigners do not. In other words, I'm here because I received a visa, but your government doesn't have to give me a visa. It gave me a visa, I'm glad it did, but I don't have a right to a visa because I don't have an Indonesian passport. That's just an example of guidelines. So if you want to go, to the Philippines, you need a visa because the Filipinos also are a nation state. And so we're talking again about guidelines about how to treat humans who are, on the one hand, evolved organisms, but on the other hand, the answer to the question, how should we behave, does not come from natural science. It comes from, that's right, culture. 14. Medical education and medical clinical practice combine nature and culture. I've given you examples of other areas of life that do that. On the one hand, medical education and clinical practice study and manipulate nature, namely the human body. When I say, by the way, the human body, I also mean the brain and the mind. On the other hand, medicine, and this is a major point, is a cultural practice. How is it a cultural practice? First of all, when you treat a human body, you treat not only a physical object, you treat not only an organism, you treat not only an example of life on our planet, you treat an organism that you believe has a moral status. You can't just do anything with a human being. Scientifically, if you want to understand, for example, the human brain, there is one model that is the best model of all, the human brain itself. But we don't do experiments on human brains because we say this is a moral being. We do our experiments to understand the human brain, maybe on a cockroach or a mouse, for example, and then try to draw inferences. Why? Because a cockroach or a mouse does not have, or we don't give to those creatures the moral status that we give to humans. We strongly object today to the horrific, barbarous practices of the Nazis in Europe and of the Japanese in Asia on patients, or on patients, on inmates, on prisoners of war. We regard that as profoundly immoral and profoundly criminal. Why? Because those behaviors did not treat these human beings as possessing a moral status. And again, that's a cultural act. Slide. I think we're misaligned. Number 15. It should say, how does clinical medical practice unavoidably involve cultural commitment? There we are. Okay, that's number 15. 16. Next. Okay. Now the question is, though, how exactly do we bring these two categories together, nature and culture? Well, first of all, you already know something about this because you study medicine. But you're not philosophers. It's not your job to be philosophers. You're medical doctors or becoming medical doctors. But as medical doctors, you do need some specialized guidance on how to conduct clinical practice in ethical ways. To practice medicine as a natural science requires some guidance by the cultural creation of morals. After all, physicians are dealing with the human body, and the human body is so profound. You cannot have well-being, or I should say your well-being in part depends upon your body. Diseases undermine your body. Sickness undermines your body. Health is a goal. We seek to heal, but we also confront aspects of our body that we can't control, ultimately, such as aging and death. And we're not indifferent to this. If you're driving along the road and you see a little squirrel dead, that's kind of sad, but you drive on. But if you're driving along and you see a dead human body, that's profound. You're going to call the police or something. And when humans die, what do? We have rituals. We have rituals. The rituals are for the living, not for the dead. The dead are gone. We humans need to cope with death. We fear death, or we don't want to leave our loved ones, or we don't want our loved ones to leave us, and so forth. All cultures have rituals around death. We give meaning, cultural meaning, to a biological phenomenon. And medicine is all about the body also as a cultural phenomenon. Let me give you some examples of how you already generate ethical knowledge simply by performing your work as physicians. Slide. Example 1. I'm going to give you, I think, about 5 examples. So when you diagnose a patient, you want to know the cause of a disease. You're looking for causality. That's natural scientific. You don't say, oh, I think a person doesn't like me and they put a spell on me and that's why I'm ill. And this involves classifying a condition as a disease. After all, it's the differentiation between health and sickness is also culture. We know so well that cancer kills. Breast cancer is the #1 killer of women in the world. But cancer is not unnatural, it's perfectly natural. You could have man-made influences on the body that create cancer, like radiation. But even without that, people get cancer. We don't want cancer. We don't want to die. That's why we say it's a disease. We need diagnostic criteria. How do you know that this is an illness? And we have these frameworks for deciding what is an illness and what is not. And over time, these change. You may have heard of the great Austrian thinker Sigmund Freud, who invented psychoanalysis, which is not regarded as natural scientific, although it's very interesting. But in any case, Sigmund Freud was working in Central Europe around 1900, and he came up with this diagnosis of sort of upper class women called hysteria. And there were these women that had these problems. They couldn't speak or they couldn't walk and so forth. And he thought, well, it's because they have this condition called hysteria. Now today, doctors say there's no such thing. It's nonsense. We're looking for a physiological, scientific explanation of why a person can't speak or can't walk. That's just an example. A better example where we have changed our definitions more recently would be, for example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. How do we understand that? What is it? Gender dysphoria. What is that? Chronic Lyme disease. Chronic fatigue syndrome. Is that really an illness? Is it not an illness? How do you know? How can you show it on a natural scientific basis? These are examples. Now, on the other hand, when we define what constitutes a disease, we do rely on cultural arguments. I said right now that we regard cancer as terrible because it kills us and we don't want to die. But it's not unnatural. It's thoroughly natural. And we're not the only organism that can get it. But this is my point. Anytime we have cultural arguments, not natural science, but culture, we have the possibility of interpretation. And interpretation could suggest different interpretations of evidence. Let me give you an example of interpretability. Look at the Holy Quran. Those are words of a text. And words, human language is not like mathematics, right? 0 and 1 are always 0 and 1. And there's no cultural aspect to that. But questions of what makes you a good Muslim? When are you acting against Muslim? Not everyone agrees on everything, and so forth, right? For example, I was interested to learn that that when a person dies, for Islam, you bury that body within 12 hours. You don't burn it. But what about cadavers? As medical students, you need to have some experience with cadavers. Is that allowed? Is that halal? I think for Indonesia it is. I don't know about other Islamic countries, but it could be a question of interpretation. Indeed, different interpretations can suggest different ways of looking at a phenomenon. Here's a different example, one that is controversial in your country as in mine, and that would be, what is homosexuality? If you read the Bible or the Quran, those ancient texts clearly say that this is unnatural. And indeed, but in history, we find that we find homosexuality throughout history. We find it in all cultures, and we find different attitudes towards it. So, for example, the ancient Greeks didn't regard it as abnormal, but the Christians did, for example. In my country, homosexuality was defined by the American Medical Association, the psychological branch, as a disease until about 1985 or 1990. Now, in the United States, a same-sex couple can get married. It would be impossible. Not so in Indonesia, but my point is simply that this question of what actually, how do we understand homosexuality? And I think an emerging idea is that human sexuality, which is very complex and very important, that's the only way we can reproduce. One idea is that there's not simply two sexes, that maybe human sexuality is kind of like a scale, a variety, perhaps. We still have disagreements and so forth, but my point is that you can see that here is the interpretation of a phenomenon that we've known throughout history, and its interpretation, at least in some parts of the world, has changed markedly. It still remains somewhat controversial in the United States, but it's also legal. In any case, that's just, when we're talking about human sexuality, we're also talking about medicine. In fact, another interesting thing about human sexuality, it is something that is so important to us, and it's where we are so vulnerable, and where our dignity is involved and so forth. The thing is, no human has direct access to his or her sexuality. We have access to our own sexuality only through a cultural lens. And there are a lot of different cultural lenses. For example, there are no human societies that do not regulate sexual practice. It's that important. And again, that's the culture, but on the other hand, we're talking about an evolved organism, and our sexuality is part of our evolved nature. Slide, next slide. Here's a different example. You physicians cannot treat the individual as if he or she was the same as every other body. It sounds silly, doesn't it? On the one hand, I said that each human is equally human, but on the other hand, we are different in our bodies in the sense that when you practice medicine, you practice on this specific patient, and this specific patient may be different from other patients. You have to treat an individual. You don't treat humankind. You tailor your treatment to the individual and specific needs of a patient. Now, to do so, you have to be culturally competent, in part, because you have to understand your patient not only as a body, but more as a body. For example, if you want to recommend lifestyle changes, you have to have some concept of what kind of lifestyle. Now, in Indonesia, I've noticed there's not much alcohol. This is in keeping with an Islamic understanding of a good life, of a proper life. The good news is, I gather, correct me if I'm wrong, Indonesia does not struggle with alcoholism. My country does, most of the Western countries do, Japan and other countries, because the problem is that people who drink alcohol may too easily drink too much. Alcoholism used to be thought of as a moral failing. Today, it's thought of as a disease, addiction. I myself feel addicted to coffee. I just cannot begin my day without that coffee. And I'm so pleased when I read in the newspaper that yet another scientist has said, you know, coffee has good for your health. That's music to my ears. But you can see that as a physician, you would need to be able to recommend someone to drink less or not to drink at all if you were treating them in my country or in Russia. Whereas you probably wouldn't think when you're diagnosing a patient in Indonesia, oh, I think the problem is alcoholism. You would look elsewhere to find the problem. This is true when you prescribe medication or when you perform, could be even involved the performing of surgeries. Next slide. Here's an example. Think about chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension, asthma. When the physician is examining the patient for these diseases, she or he is also monitoring the patient's lifestyle. And lifestyles are cultural creations. They're culturally embedded. There isn't a lifestyle for humankind. There are different lifestyles. And when we think about them, we have some notion of a good quality of life. But what is a good quality of life? Actually, that's not entirely objective. This, by the way, can be powerfully seen in part when if we discuss matters with those members of our community who are disabled. It is a common phenomenon that people who are fully abled believe that disabled persons have a quality of life that's very low. But many persons who are disabled say, no, I have a rich life. I don't feel that my life is less. This gets more complicated, but the point is, the idea of a quality of life is culturally inflected. And physicians need to be sensitive to this question, well, how do we think about a quality of life when I practice medicine, trying to provide a good quality of life? Slide. What about when you practice preventative health care, prophylaxis? You have to have some notion of a healthy lifestyle and of proper nutrition. People don't eat the same things. I've learned this is my 8th week in Indonesia, and I have learned a number of things. First of all, Indonesians love to eat. There's a lot of good food in Indonesia. If you go traveling, you can always find a store that will sell food for you so that you will have food to take with you. You eat rice, not once, not twice, but 3 times a day. You can have rice and nothing else, it's a meal. But if you have everything but no rice, it's not a meal. And, that's culturally influenced, this strong devotion to rice. And rice is wonderful in some ways. It's also problematic as there are a lot of carbohydrates there. And we don't want to eat too many carbohydrates, right? We want vegetables and we want fruit. So what's a healthy lifestyle? What would be unacceptable in Indonesian culture would be certainly a life without rice. That sounds like a horror movie, right? But it might be recommended for health reasons to decrease the consumption of rice, to decrease the consumption of beef and increase the consumption of fish, for example. Next slide. The medical profession also confronts ethical questions that are profound, and it confronts these questions every day. Let me give you some examples. For example, you have what you might think of as a right to public health, but then also a right of privacy. For example, COVID-19. That really that was a pandemic, affected the entire world profoundly in terrible ways. And from a purely public health standpoint, we could use our cell phones, download an app that would allow us to trace contacts. And if somebody that you'd had contact with tested positive for COVID, you would be notified, and you would know, I think I need to be quarantined. I need to be tested for COVID, and if I have it, I need to be quarantined. Makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of public health. On the other hand, people might say, but my privacy. I don't want the government to know who I'm meeting, or some organization, private organization, to have this kind of information. It's maybe undignified for people to know this information about me. I have my own private life. How do you balance public health with a right to privacy? For example, or here's a different example, organ transplantation. Organ transplantation can save lives and improve lives in important ways. But we never have enough organs. We always have these waiting lists. And some people, if they wait long enough, they will die. So the question is, when we distribute this valuable and scarce resource, by what criteria? Who should be on the top of the list? Medical urgency? How long someone has already waited? Whether the organ is compatible? Should children receive a transplant organ before an adult? That question cannot be answered by science. That is a cultural question involving issues of justice and so forth. And it is also a question for medical doctors. Slide. I said that the task of bioethics is in one sense bringing together two things, nature and culture. In other words, how do we treat humans in medical contexts, not only medically, but also with regard to their moral status? And to answer this question, we have to think about the relationship between nature and culture. In other words, clinical medicine cannot avoid ethical questions, which is one of the reasons why medical education should include instruction in bioethics. Some examples, slide. I've already mentioned the allocation of valuable but limited social resources. This appears in other ways. For example, we have limited research funds. What should we fund? Cancer, not surprisingly, receives a great deal of funding, but there are a lot of other diseases that don't receive so much, and maybe the fewer the people that have this disease, maybe there's less money invested, and you have to ask yourself, is that the best way to go about deciding which research to fund? Because the more you fund research, more likely you will find some kind of treatment, maybe even solution. It's a life and death issue, as so much in medicine. Slide, yeah. A second example, the distribution of healthcare resources, barriers to access, social determinants to health. In other words, one slogan that makes a lot of sense is 3 words. Wealth is health. It means the more money you have, the better health you probably have. And the poorer you are, more likely you have poor health. One approach to this is a national health plan. Indonesia has one, rather recent, but it's a great achievement. In my country, it's still impossible. We have the medicine, we have the money, but we have political disagreements. So that there are poor people in America today that have no medicine, that die because they have no medicine. And the state that I come from, Texas, is the worst. It has more women and children without health insurance than any other place in the United States. It's barbaric. And health insurance is the attempt to make it possible for everyone to receive medical care, which means, among other things, that medicine should not be treated like a commodity, like a bag of rice or a shirt or a car. Medicine is different. It does need economy. It does need money. But it shouldn't be distributed simply to those that can afford it. We would argue from a moral standpoint. Slide. Another example, technologies to assist sexual reproduction. For example, in vitro fertilization. This will involve the use of fertilized embryos. Question, what is the moral status of the human embryo? I think most people would say it's not a person, on the one hand, or not a person yet, but on the other hand, it's not an object. If a couple selects this embryo, do we dispose of the other embryo? This could involve the status of surrogate motherhood. I understand this is not a practice allowed in Indonesia. Interestingly, in the West, one country where a lot of surrogate mothers come from is Ukraine, which has been attacked by Russia. But this is the question, you know. I mean, imagine a woman has an embryo implanted, and she's hormonally prepared and so forth, and then she gives birth. Who's the mother? Is it the egg donor or the woman who carried the embryo to term? This is not a natural scientific question. You can say, talk about where the DNA, who with the DNA, and so on and so forth. But when we say mother, we mean so much more. By the way, here's just a side note. I remember speaking once with a person who worked in hospice. Hospice is a status when people are dying, and they know they're going to die, and therefore they don't receive medical attention to try to overcome. Then medicine just tries to make their passing as comfortable as possible. And she said there's one word that she heard in hospice more than any other. One word. Mother. I think that says something about the profound attachment we have to the women who carried us. Not only carried us, but also probably raised us. Most humans learn language, their own language, from women, because most women are caretakers. I wonder, future doctors, how will you deal with your children in the sense of you have a demanding profession, you have children. Who's going to take care of those children? The woman? The man? Will you 50-50? 60-40? Do women stop their practices for a while when they get pregnant or give birth? Something that a man probably doesn't do? These are not natural scientific questions, cultural questions. What should be allowed? What should be prohibited? These are cultural questions. Slide. How about something, this is not allowed in Indonesia, and that is physician-assisted suicide. And I mean very specific, something very specific. A person who has been diagnosed scientifically by medical professionals to have a terminal illness, and it will kill them, I think, within 6 months or less. And this person is mentally competent and has discussed with his or her physician. Should that person be allowed to terminate his or her life with the assistance of a physician if she feels that maybe it's painful or undignified to live with tubes in your nose and other parts of your body and needles in your arm and so forth. Here, and I should say physician-assisted suicide is very controversial. It's not legal in the United States except for the state of Oregon, although the Supreme Court is open to the idea, but it fears that there's no way to prevent the abuse. And as long as this could be abused, it says it's not legal. It's legal in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, but I don't know if in any other countries. But as physicians, you have knowledge about a human being who is in pain, who is suffering, both emotionally and physically, and you know something about compassion. If it were legal, you would have the question how to balance the autonomy of the individual who says, this is what I want, with the idea of relief from suffering or the patient's beliefs. Or again, this is something I've also learned about Indonesia. Your culture is quite communitarian. It's families. You have a very familial, people help each other. And I think Indonesians often think in terms of relationships, more so than we in the West. We think more individualistically. And so my understanding is that with regard to some medical decisions, the family in Indonesia has a status. Some status, more status than in the United States. That's culture. But when you want to balance these various factors, you're doing not natural science, you're doing culture. Slide. Here's another example, genetic testing. Genetic testing is remarkable because it can provide us information about your body, including, for example, predispositions to certain kinds of diseases. The problem is that information is very valuable and can be dangerous. If the insurance, if you needed to buy private insurance, and your insurance company knew that you had a predisposition for this or that disease, that the company might say, we won't insure you because we don't want to pay out. If we don't know, we're just hoping you don't. But if we know you're going to have it, we won't insure you. Or maybe other people, if they knew your data. Can you imagine a young man and a young woman about your age, deeply in love, thinking about a life together, children, and so forth. But then they look at each other's gene scan and say, oh gosh, I'm not sure I want to marry this person. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? In any case, if we say that this kind of information could be the basis for discrimination, then we are using a cultural concept. Discrimination is a cultural way of looking at the world. It's not a natural scientific or natural scientific way of looking at the world. Slide. This is my last example, and it's a big one. Equality. You have to ask, what is equality? I mentioned that Indonesia subscribes to the proposition that men and women are morally and legally equal. Okay, we know what that means, but what about raising children? I ask that too. Who raises children? Who raises children the most? Is there equality there? Does your legal and moral equality as a woman extend to your husband taking 50% at least responsibility for raising children and cleaning the house and cooking the meals and cleaning the dishes? And moreover, isn't the case that the woman marries out of her family into some others, so she's also first taking care of children and then taking care of old people, namely maybe the parents of her husband? Is that equality? Well, it's a cultural argument. Now imagine emerging biotechnologies that can edit genes toward preventing diseases in future people. This is a very, very significant goal for all kinds of reasons, but bear this fact in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Roughly 6% of all babies born, 6% of all babies born have a serious birth defect of genetic origin or of partly genetic origin. 6%. Only genetic science and only medicine can reduce that number. Now, we can reduce that number in a variety of ways. As you know from your study of genetics, we can treat a body somatically, one body, or we can treat the germline, the gamete, and therefore the modification is inherited. And in that way, we humans are actually changing a bit of our evolution. Germline gene editing offers treatment for single gene disorders, and it can contribute to overcoming polygenic diseases. It offers some couples, this is so important, it offers some couples the only way to avoid passing on single gene disorders in cases where neither in vitro fertilization, IVF, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is possible. And you're young, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not quite as young as you. I've oxidized a bit. But I know this, that some people, quite a few people, and certainly as they get older, have often a strong desire for children, their own children. It's a powerful desire. And couples that have fertility problems will go to great lengths to see if they can have their own baby. What do they want generally? I know this from a colleague of mine who is in the profession of IVF. He says generally couples want one thing only. They want a healthy baby. They're not talking skin pigmentation, hair color, height, sex, propensity for athletic or artistic talent or so forth. No, they want a little baby that has 10 toes and 10 fingers, and they want that baby so badly. And sometimes, without genetic intervention, they can only give birth to a baby that will be condemned to suffer from genetic disease. So this is part of the great promise of emerging biotechnological advances. But whereas PGD and IVF are not powerful enough to select against polygenic diseases, germline gene editing, where we affect the gametes, the sperm cells and the egg cells, allows multiple changes to be made to a single embryo. It can target many different genes simultaneously. Multiple targeting is very important. After all, the majority of common diseases don't result from single gene mutations. No, they result from a polygenic disposition together with environmental influences. Diabetes involves at least 44 genes. Common cancers can involve more than 300 genes. This is part of the difficulty of finding a cure for cancer. But now we come to a dilemma. And again, this dilemma is not in science, and it's not in technology, but it is in culture. And that is the idea that people should be treated equally. Now, applying a technology designed to prevent genetic disease, in fact, could generate, maybe unintentionally, new forms of inequality. After all, this stuff is not inexpensive. Certainly at the beginning, it's very expensive. So who's going to enjoy the benefits of new breakthroughs in genetic science? The rich. People who are already strongly situated will only get stronger. And the weak among us and the poor among us will only get weaker and poorer because of the distribution of this technology. Consider unequal access in technology because people simply can't afford it. And in that sense, unequal access discriminates against people who happen to to be weakly situated socioeconomically. The inequality is not in the technology. The inequality is not in the science. The inequality is in the way we organize our societies. For example, if you can pay for it, you can have it. If you can't pay for it, sorry. Even if we're talking about your body and your health. Slide. So what's the takeaway, the upshot, the point? It's that neither medical education nor clinical practice can answer these cultural questions in the same way that it can answer natural scientific questions about the human body. Natural science, for its part, though, does not tell us how to behave. Nothing about how we should behave follows from natural science. Natural science really doesn't have meaning. It does tell us what is true. The earth revolves around the sun, or that we have, the composition of water, or what the human genome looks like. But that doesn't say, well, what's a disease and what's not, and how do we distribute medicine and so forth. So the main reason why bioethics is important to medical education and to clinical practice is that communities need to construct and reconstruct and think about guidelines, moral guidelines, ethical guidelines, legal guidelines for medical practice. These guidelines will not come from within medicine insofar as medicine is a natural science. They will come from within medicine and outside of medicine insofar as medicine is also a cultural practice. Slide. So they'll come from communities in part, right? I said they can't come from one person. They have to come from many people. And there are different types of communities. One community that I think we would want to involve are ordinary people. Ordinary people. You folks are more than ordinary. You're extraordinary. You're unusually intelligent. You're educated. And that's wonderful. And you know about science and other things. But what about people that don't know so much? You can imagine, in rural communities of Indonesia, for example, but maybe even parts of Bandung. But we don't, I think, want to exclude ordinary people from also thinking about how we should view our bodies with regard to its moral status and how we should treat. We need, I think, to include ordinary people. I think to do so, we have to do other things, such as improved education, improved science literacy. That's not easy. We also, of course, need the advice of experts in ethics and bioethics and so forth. Slide. Slide. But who, ladies and gentlemen, have I not mentioned? That's right, you. Physicians, the people who deliver the treatment to the patient, they too need to be involved in constructing at least some of the moral and legal guidelines for at least some parts of medical practice. Now, I don't mean to suggest that you don't already have some knowledge about ethical guidelines. You have access to ethical guidelines and policies that are established by organized medicine, institutions, accepted standards, and so clinical practice. 33. And you learn things, ladies and gentlemen, when you engage patients and you understand their perspectives. Physicians learn to appreciate the complexities. This morning, I heard from a woman, a physician, who said that sometimes she would recommend urgent medical care and it would be rejected. And she asked me, am I a failed doctor if my patient rejects what I'm offering? They don't want to be treated. Or someone else mentioned that a man did not want to be treated by a female physician. He did not want to be treated by a woman doctor. Only a male doctor, he said. My point here is that when you, in your practice, hear these kinds of things, your mind goes to work and you think, oh my gosh, well, this is a prejudice against women. This is a prejudice against women that's undermining the patient. What a twisted way of looking at the world. Not only do you think women are inferior, but you're going to sacrifice your own health because of this crazy knowledge, or this crazy perspective, I should say. So you learn in the field some things. You participate in case discussions, ethics committees, conferences. You exchange information. In complex cases, you may seek consultations with ethics experts. Physicians are always already exposed to ethical thinking, to be sure. What I'm arguing for is for the inclusion of a systematic bioethics component in medical education, and maybe then follow-up courses for physicians where the discussion is more reflected, more detailed, wider, and perhaps more informed, as in addition to what you already know, not in place of. Slide. So, and what about medical students? Given the ethical questions generated by medical practices, medical education should include ethics-related topics. You students should have opportunities to explore ethical principles. Ethical principles are always plural. There are a number of them, and you should be aware of the variety, and you should think about why you might prefer one over the other. You should have opportunities to analyze cases. You should have opportunities to discuss emerging technologies, including human genetic engineering, including the use of artificial intelligence in medicine. These new technologies will pose new questions, and moreover, you young people are closer to these technologies than older people, and they will shape your world and your life much more than they shaped my world and my life, and a lot of questions have yet to be answered. Slide. Now, of course, taking instruction in bioethics in medical education is not supposed to make you into a moral philosopher. That's not your job. Rather, it seeks to develop your capacity and motivation to participate as medical professionals in the larger social discussion of many ethical dimensions. It means that doctors also will have a voice in the public sphere, in the newspapers. Well, I don't know if people read newspapers. Online, in television, in politics, and elsewhere, where people will say, I'm a physician from my standpoint, or we are physicians from our standpoint. Doctors should not stand on the sidelines of many important issues. Precisely as physicians, they should articulate a viewpoint. They should listen to other viewpoints. And of course, doctors will not all agree with one another. They can say, well, okay, here's the range. Physicians cannot tackle these issues by themselves, but society cannot adequately tackle these issues without your help and input and expertise. Slide. So medical education needs a bioethical component to encourage also future physicians to commit to careful ethical reflection with colleagues and to engage other people in society outside of medicine, and to continuously develop your knowledge and thinking about ethics and skills throughout your career as you make new experiences and new scientific developments and technological advances occur. Slide. Slide. Isn't that a beautiful word? Whew. Inshallah. Thank you, thank you. Slide. So, to sum up, physicians can better confront ethical questions in their medical practice if they have some background in bioethics. They don't need to be a bioethical expert. I'm talking about some familiarity, some background. That background will help them to identify ethical questions in clinical practice. It will assist them in analyzing those ethical challenges. It will encourage them to engage these issues in dialogue with other physicians and with people outside of medicine. It will help them to consider a variety of ethical perspectives. And it will aid them in identifying maybe weaknesses in their own argument and in the arguments of their colleagues that they could work on improving. Slide. Now, because bioethics is open-ended, it's not a project that you complete and we know everything. It's open-ended. And the effort to identify and respond to ethical questions in medical practice will be a permanent effort. It's a need that can never be exhausted. Slide.
Thank you so much, Professor Greg, for the insightful lecture, and it is very beneficial for all of us. Okay, moving on to the next session. Please take a seat. Okay, let's moving on to the next session. We will have question and answer session. This session will be divided into two sections. The first one, we will have the question from the online participants. After that, we will have from the offline participants. For all the online participants who have the question, please raise your hand. Okay, I see one from... Okay, I see one from Aan. Okay, Aan, the time is yours.
Is it audible? Yeah, I think, is it audible? Is it audible?
Yes, you are audible now.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Professor. It was a very insightful talk. I think I have two questions, and this might be deviating a bit from the main point of the bioethics itself, but more about the ethical theories itself. So my first question is, ethical theories are built upon cultural observations, right? And culture changes, which means it has to, ethics has to constantly catch up with these changes. But research in ethics presumably takes time, and debates might persist, and some might never even reach a conclusion. So I imagine there would be a lag between what's being researched and what's actually going on. And if we compare it to natural science, if we imagine, let's say, this is the truth and the facts, and this is research, natural science would, by time, close the gap between what's unknown and what's the fact. But ethical research will have to constantly catch up with changes in culture. So my question is, are we catching up? And if so, how do we know? And I think my second question is quite related as well, is there seems to be a gap between higher level philosophy and fields that discuss the fundamentals of ethics. There seems to be a gap between that and the end users or the day-to-day policy related considerations. I mean, there is a field of applied ethics, but I've just started reading a few articles around ethics as well. And it seems like the gap seems to be still there, and is it still there today? And if so, how are we progressing? I think that's the question. I hope it was clear enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Aan, for the question.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this even on? Okay.
Yes.
There you are. Oh, oh, I should sit here so that I see, so that you can see me. And maybe, okay. Although I can't see my addressee, which is a little peculiar, but okay. Um, thank you for an excellent question. It's actually a profound question because you say that in natural science, we can measure progress and we can know that we have made progress, whereas in ethics, how could we possibly know that we have made progress? That's an excellent observation, excellent question, and I think the answer emphasizes the profound distinction between natural science on the one hand and ethics on the other. In one sense, we might say that natural science, even though it's quite complex and can be quite difficult, is easier because you have right answers. And there's something wonderful. My wife is a molecular biologist. When she gives a talk, she writes one equation on the board. Everyone knows exactly what she means. But when I talk, I have to recreate the whole world because all my terms can be understood in different ways. But I've tried to say again and again that we don't want to do science without ethics. In fact, in many ways, we do science precisely because of ethics, because science and technology can improve our lives in so many ways. And maybe also simply because it is maybe a fulfillment of part of our dignity and moral value as human beings to know about our natural world. So I think the question, is there moral progress, have we made moral progress, is quite challenging. But I would say that we cannot know the answer to that question the way we can know the answer to the question in science, but we can know something still. I would say that there is moral progress. This room, as I said earlier, is example of it. That is to say, I think that it is a very few people, and it's a minoritarian cultural perspective that says women are inferior to men, that says women should be excluded from higher education or education and so forth. Now, that is not a natural scientific proposition, but we can reassure ourselves in many different ways that our world makes more sense practically and morally when we treat women as equal with men. Where women are excluded, first of all, that community or society is simply throwing away all of the potential that women bring, and women bring exactly as much potential as men do in terms of cognitive capacity. So that's like punching yourself in the face, hitting your head with a hammer. Why would you do that? I think because you are beholden to a really stupid viewpoint, such as the one taken by the Taliban. They're fanatics, and it's a miserable life. Humans know something about misery. We know a lot about misery. No, I don't think any slave has ever said, oh, it's great to be a slave. I can't imagine someone who is reduced to the violence and degradation of prostitutes saying, oh, I always wanted to be a prostitute. These are people who know misery, and we can measure not only natural scientifically, but also culturally, the diminution of suffering. We see that, for example, when I see a classroom that's more than 50% females, freely, based on merit of, of having good enough grades and so forth, achievement to achieve medical school. So what a woman achieves is just what a man achieves. But this is better for both men and women. And there are a lot of different ways that we can reassure ourselves that is moral progress. Of course, it's not a proof, but there are no proofs in morality. I would say one last thing to your question, because your country and mine are similar in various respects, but one interesting respect that is underappreciated is we both come from religious countries. The United States is religious in the way that Europe is not. By that I mean to say religion plays a powerful role in daily life, also at politics at the highest level, as in Indonesia. And religions are ethical systems, and they provide guidelines. And I think the task for your country, as for mine, in the future, is working with these profound religious systems so that they accord with natural scientific learning and also secular bioethics. It doesn't mean that Islam or Christianity is threatened. It means that Islam and Christianity, to realize their own potential, need to develop in thoughtful ways along with science and secular bioethics. So that, for example, when in Islam you answer questions such as, can you perform an autopsy on the corpse of a Muslim? I think the answer that will help everyone, and not only Muslims, is yes, because we can improve our knowledge. We can make a better life. Isn't that what Islam wants? A better life? A better life? So, a different issue is IVF. I mentioned before that in Indonesia, the sperm donor and the egg donor must be married to each other. Those are the only conditions under which, and I understand that, but I also mentioned the deep desire of some people to have children, and that couldn't have but one reason they may not have children is because a man or a woman hasn't found a partner, the right partner for them. Should they be included or not? I would only say that as you have this understanding in Indonesia about who should be able to engage to use IVF, that one takes quite seriously the question, what about answering the needs of people who don't fit that mold of man and wife? What about their needs and deep wishes and their capacity to be good parents? I'm not answering the question. I'm just saying that I think this would be a way to try to make moral progress by asking these questions rather than saying settled and done. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the question. For the answer. And we are going to moving on for the next question. For all the online participants who still have a question, may raise your hand. Okay, I see one. Alexis, you may proceed.
Okay, am I audible?
I'll sit down again, but first I want to know who I'm speaking with. Alexis?
Yes, okay. Hi, Professor Greg. Thank you so much for your lecture earlier. I think I have a question, but first of all, I would like to say a little bit about Indonesia. And I think it's true that here in Indonesia, we are a very culture-based country. And as where cultures, moral or social systems or ideas and prejudice may place a huge part in the daily life decision making. And I think even now we can see that there are a lot of situations, I think, in social media where credibilities of like the younger physicians is like a hot topic, kind of like a hot topic here in Indonesia. Or like in real life, I think there are a lot of situation where, as you have said in the example before, like patients who refuse to be treated by female doctors and etc. I think it really does happen in Indonesia. So my question is, if later on when we have already become like doctors who practice in like clinics or like health facilities and we do encounter one of the situation, do you like have any tips or like any help for us for when we encounter those situation? Is there any tips from you for how to build or create arguments when it really happens? Oh, I think that's for my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would say that the physician, for many reasons, should have a discussion with patients. Listen carefully, but also be willing to argue for some insights from medicine. What does that mean? For example, a patient who said, I don't want to be treated by a woman, you must ask yourself, well, why? I mean, imagine someone said, I don't want to be treated by someone who is 5'6", only someone who's 5'8", or only someone that has long ears instead of short ears. You would say, that's crazy. I mean, how absurd. Why isn't the objection to women equally absurd? You could argue with a patient by saying, sir, I think, let's explore the foundation of your thoughts. Why do you think, you wouldn't be well served by a woman? And I would imagine that person, I wonder what they would say. You could say for your part that we know empirically that men and women have equal cognitive capacities. I mean, we find a variety of capacities, but they don't seem to be sex linked. That medical education doesn't distinguish between men and women. That the capacity to be a physician is not a sex-linked capacity. And to refuse medical treatment on the basis of a belief that cannot be defended is self-undermining. It hurts yourself. Who says, oh, I want to suffer? I don't want to be treated. I want my disease to continue. If you say instead, I don't want my disease, I would like to overcome my disease, then you really should be open to the idea that this person can help you. The fact that this person is female has no relevance. It's like eye color or the shape of your toes or so forth. I mean, people are irrational. This is true. One thing that I've often wondered about is, why do humans in the modern world attach so much significance to skin pigmentation? Our largest organ is our epidermis, our skin. It does useful things. We can sweat. There's a lot of advantage to that. But the color these days has no biological function. Maybe, in terms of evolution, if you're up north and you're not getting enough vitamin C, you have whiter skin, you can get more, okay, fine. But these days that means nothing. And nothing follows from that. And yet, and I speak as an American, where we have struggled with race and struggled with race today. And you've seen, you see this in many parts of the world. Our societies still confront prejudices that are irrational. And of course, the prejudice against women, it's absolutely irrational. I think if physicians could reason, do their best, of course, that's an optimistic viewpoint that I'm articulating. You will find people that are not prepared to listen and so forth. But I do think that in response to your question, Juliet, Alexis, that the physician should in any case make the attempt to speak with the patient to try to identify the source of this belief that's harmful. You already have to do this in another sense, by the way. Here in Indonesia, this is an old, rich country, rich in natural resources. and cultures, which means you also have many types of traditional medicine in Indonesia. And probably some of them are really effective, but others are really harmful. And precisely the physician, more than anybody else, has to say to those Indonesians who still want to practice traditional forms of medicine that are harmful, not are helpful, but are harmful, this is a bad idea. Let me explain why. You're not a bad person for having inherited this, but we now know. Because can we not always agree on this? What do we want? We want health. We want to be healthy ourselves. We want our children to be healthy. And if the physician can make an argument by saying, if you follow this path, you will be unhealthy or your child will be unhealthy. But if you follow this path, you will be healthy or your child will be healthy. If you love your child, follow the path that will make your child healthy. And you could say that against cultural beliefs such as female genital cutting, which is practiced in many countries for a variety of reasons and creates so much misery. And again, I think that if one could say to the mother, actually a mother who has been cut herself has the most strongest, when she says, I stand up and I say no, because I don't want my daughter to suffer. What better reason would you need? And how powerful could those words be, at least for some people? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Greg, for the answers. Okay, because of the limited time, I think we are going to moving on for the offline participants. To offline participants who have an answer, please raise your hand. Hello, Professor. First of all, I would like to say thank you for your awesome presentation, because I'm interested in euthanasia and LGBTQA and a lot of things that like ethic controversial. And what I'm wanna ask today is in Indonesia, there's a controversial about gender reaffirmation surgery, like gender dysphoria, and then gender reaffirmation, so male to female and female to male. And I know some case, so there is a first gender reaffirmation surgery in Ciptomangunkusumo Hospital from the male to female. But I know there's some doctor in plastic surgeon who does not want to perform that operation. And I want to know your opinion about the ethics and moral about I think the decision that made by the doctor. I think that's my question. Thank you.
Excellent question. Excellent question. On the one hand, there is what might call a kind of freedom of the individual person providing a service, that maybe they should be able to make some decisions. But I think that we need to distinguish between what is being provided and how it's being provided. Let me give you an example. If you, in your private house, decide to rent a room, like Airbnb, and you say, you know, I'm against homosexual conduct, I don't want to rent my room to a homosexual couple, I could see the argument that, okay, it's your private home, it's one room, okay. But if it's a hotel in general, by definition, is open to the whole community. And if that hotel says we will not accept this type of person and not that type of person, that's a form of discrimination that I think should not be allowed. Because by definition, the vendor is providing a public service. Whereas as a homeowner, it's something on the side. Now, with regard to medicine, and this is so critical, is often in my country poses itself. So the there are people who oppose a woman's right to abortion. It's now no longer legal at the federal level in the United States, as you know, but in some states, not in my state of Texas. But there are some physicians, for example, that say, not physicians, apotheke, pharmacists who say, I don't want to distribute birth control because I believe it's wrong to prevent birth from happening. This would be the stance of the Catholic Church, for example. And I would say that when we're talking about medicine, I think that medicine should not be thought of as in any private capacity, the way you can think of your house as a private. If you are a physician, I believe you should be willing to provide whatever is legal, regardless of your personal opinion. If you really feel strongly about this, don't be a physician. There are many other professions where you could, but I think the individual physician should not have a legal right to deny medical care that is regarded as legal, as safe, as allowable on an individual basis. I think that allows the individual too much power over providing something that's not like a bottle of water. We're talking about a human life, human dignity, quality of life, and in that sense, I think physicians should be bound by their profession to perform regardless of their opinion. That's my opinion.
Thank you so much, Prof. Okay, let's moving on. Is there any other question from the offline participants? Okay, you may come down here.
Baik, mungkin sebelum saya mulai untuk bertanya, saya izin kepada dokter, Akang Teteh, dan juga teman-teman semua untuk kembali memperhatikan lecture ini, karena tadi saya lihat ketika sesi pertanyaan dan juga sesi tanya jawab, ada beberapa teman-teman Akang Teteh di sini yang masih banyak ngobrol dan kiranya itu sangat mengganggu kegiatan hari ini. Terima kasih. Okay, thank you, Professor, for the lecture. I want to ask some question. Maybe I want to know about your opinion, about your thought about what is now happening in Indonesia about professional organization. Yep. In Indonesia, it's still being debated that professional organization for physician, there is Indonesian Medical Association, as we know, ED. And in the new law that government still constructing now, there is a shift from the functional part of the professional organization from regulator through operational. It's like the government want to shift the function of the professional organization from regulating the ethical aspect to supervising the government law to the ethical aspect for the physician. And what I want to know from you, how it is going to be, how's the position should be the professional organization about the ethical issues. Maybe that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you very much for your question. And I strongly believe that physicians have a role to play that only physicians can play, that the government cannot play. The government has a role to play, but the government cannot play the role of physicians. There is a division of labor here, and also a division of expertise and experience and insight. And if that division is not respected, the outcome will be worse. Physicians, government, the tasks of government in part is to administer a society, help it to function, maybe identify failures and come up with solutions. But government officials are not physicians. Government officials don't know patients. Government officials often don't know a lot about science. And government officials, God knows, may not be particularly ethical. There's probably a lot more corruption in any government than there is in any medical profession. And the idea that the government would regulate in place of physicians is a terrible idea, simply because the motivation of the government may well have nothing to do with the motivations that would guide a physician. Government cannot play the role of physicians, and physicians need to fight for their voice. And I think that bioethics is part of this awareness that physicians have specialized knowledge and also specialized ethical knowledge. And one has to ask, why would the government in Indonesia want to displace physicians from making these decisions? The reason won't be grounded in medicine. It won't be grounded in providing better medical care. It will have something to do with power, distribution of power, phenomena that is not related to health. And so it would be misguided, in my mind, to allow physicians to be displaced in their capacity to advise and to decide and to monitor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the answers. Okay, maybe we will still have time for one more question. Is there any other question? Okay, I see him first.
Okay, good afternoon, professors. Thank you for your great lecture. So, to be honest, it is, how do I say it? It was such a mind-breaking lecture because I had a lot more questions that I think it could ever answer. But after hearing the previous questions, I think there are the previous questions are some examples of problems that you have mentioned, that is the cultural problem. And I want to ask that, because there is, from what I have understood from your lecture, there is no universal agreement on the definition of bioethics, and so the cultural problems it always can be debated. And so if we have to encounter, if we as a doctor in the future have to encounter a point where we have to decide a solution for a problem that is cultural, I would like to know your view on what do we need to do to create or reach such an agreement on that cultural problem, even though that it is perpetually debatable. I hope that is understood. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent question. I believe the physician can bioethically analyze some issues that will come up in medical practice. First of all, I think that the physician should be aware or make himself aware or make herself aware of the variety of positions already. On many issues, people have already thought, and the first step would be to acquaint oneself with some of the variety of positions. One can learn that there are positions that one never thought about that might be valuable. One might read positions that one thinks are really wrong, but now it's very clear, clearly stated, and you can say better why you think it is wrong. Beyond that, I think the physician should discuss with others. Medical practice is not a solo phenomenon, it's a group phenomenon. Medicine is done in communities of doctors, physicians, and specialists, and so forth. And I think that that within that community, there are perspectives that one could learn about. And through discussion, one could think about one's own arguments and be open to change when one is presented with an argument that strikes you as actually, that's a better argument. The peculiarly powerless power of the better argument. Be open to that. I think that we humans need to fight against an inclination to want a world in which everything is settled with clear, bright lines and categories. It makes life simpler and so forth. That vision doesn't correspond to human reality, and it never will. So we have to be comfortable somewhat, I think, with one might say the moral messiness of life. We will not experience complete ethical certitude, I think, unless we're dogmatists. And a dogmatist is always a bad idea, because dogmatism is the position that my way is right, but doesn't reason it just because I say so, or because it has been said in the past. Morally, that's not a very strong argument. The best argument in the world is an argument that says, this is clear, I understand it, and for these reasons I accept it or reject it. And the physician needs to do that as well, although it will never be completely satisfying, because there aren't solutions that will end debate. In a very broad sense, if we say the task is to do justice, well, what is justice? We don't have a single definition of justice. I don't think we'll ever have it. But that does not mean that we cannot do justice and have some notion of justice that we can revise over time, modify, change, and build upon. We don't need perfection to do good things in this world, and we will never have perfection. It's also, in science, we know today so much more than, let's say, the ancient Romans did about physics, chemistry, engineering. But that doesn't mean that 2,000 years ago the Romans couldn't do wonderful things. If you go to Europe today, you can see some aqueducts still standing after 2,000 years. It's a tribute to what they could do. In other words, to have more knowledge is good, but to have some knowledge, you can do something with already some knowledge. And this is true, I think, also from a moral or ethical perspective. The poignant difficulty of being a human is that sometimes we humans have to make a choice when we can't be sure it's the best choice. And we hope it's the best choice, and if it's not, we will learn. but we have to be then also open to making mistakes and to being wrong. The saving grace is that we can realize maybe we were wrong and change. But at any given time, some of our ideas will be wrong, some of our moral commitments will be perverse, and some of our commitments may be misguided. But under these conditions, we humans have in history made progress, and so we have to believe in our capacity to do better, even though we will always be limited. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Greg. And we will have the one last question.
Thank you so much for the very insightful lecture you gave to me, Prof. I have a short question. I want to ask regarding the political disagreements regarding the healthcare issues in United States. No problem. So I just have a short question. I want to know regarding the political disagreements about the healthcare system in the United States. Can you explain it to me regarding it? Because I'm not too aware about American politics. Thank you.
So the question is, what about the healthcare system in the United States? Oh. The United States is a wealthy country. It is often at the cutting edge of developments. I don't know, I'm told, I'm not a doctor, that the best cancer treatment in the world is done in Houston at MD Anderson. But that said, I would say that the American healthcare system in some ways is a failure. It's a failure not because of science, not because of technology, not because of wealth or money. It's a political failure, or it's a failure for political reasons. And here you can see where culture really can be our worst enemy. The United States, as you know, developed from British colonies. And the colonists, the elite in the colonies, objected to having to pay tax to King George in England, and yet they had no voice in London. And so they revolted. Finally, the British left, like the Dutch finally left Indonesia. And so you have these 13 little states, and they're very independent-minded, but things didn't work. You couldn't control cross-border traffic with regard to goods and tariffs and so forth. And so eventually, after 10 years, they formed a country, the United States, but the United States is founded on a principle of jealousy. The states originally said, Uncle Sam, the federal government, you have no power unless we give it to you. And the mentality in the United States is to think the government may be bad. It's going to take my freedom away. It's the big boot of a terrible, oppressive, dictatorial regime. This is deep in American political culture. It is a kind of pathology. It harms America to a great extent. America is capable of having a good national health care system, and it doesn't for one reason and one reason only: politics. This belief of many Americans and a large part of the Republican Party that the federal government is as oppressive as the government of China and Russia and North Korea. It's really kind of a mental illness. It's the same reason that we Americans have an obscene amount of violence in our country. No industrialized country is as violent as the United States. I'm talking about gun deaths again and again and again. And you would say, why is this possible? Again, politics. Why? Because in a document that was drafted in 1787, it says, okay, we're going to have a national government now. We're going to have one country. No, who should have a gun? And it says, well, militia. What's a militia? We don't have militias, but it would be maybe, well, ordinary people would have a gun. The man would have a gun at home, and when there's needed, he would bring it, and so forth. In any case, since then, we know we have a professional army and so forth, but we still have this idea as interpreted by the Supreme Court that a person has a right to a gun. Well, you know, there are lots of guns in Switzerland, and there are lots of guns in Austria, and there are lots of guns in Finland, but they don't kill each other. There's something in American culture, some pathology, that with this freedom to own guns, and not small guns, even, you know, big guns and so forth, it leads again and again to slaughter, and Americans can't do anything about it. There are big political interests. There's the American Rifle Association, big lobbyists and so forth, that says that you can't be politically free if you don't have a right to a gun. I think that's nonsense, but how do you change a political culture? This is just like the national healthcare system, where there are people in America today that die needlessly because of the absence of a national healthcare system. We are insured basically through our employers, and that means that there's not one plan. If you have some employers provide better plans, other providers provide poorer plans. Some people are not employed or don't have any plan. And the only way to fix these two problems, and I think gun-related problems is related to health, it's death, is to change American culture, and that's really difficult. And right now, America is worse, more divided than ever before, or at least for many years now. And we have, I think we only have, we're actually, I think, a one-party state. We have one rational party, and we have one party that in part is crazy. And the political system can't, so far, heal itself. It's very discouraging. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen of Indonesia, it is so wonderful to be in a country, at least for 8 weeks, where I don't have to be worried about getting shot. Congratulations. You are really civilized. And I hope someday that you Indonesians will bring civilization to my country, because we really need it. It is, again, speaking about culture, these are examples of where culture is our worst enemy. This is also an example of how difficult it is to change culture. One last remark on this. Like many countries, America had a system of legalized slavery. And when America was formed, there were people that objected to slavery. And the last thing that Benjamin Franklin, the great Benjamin Franklin, ever said, he was not a delegate, he was so old, but he said to the Congress that was drawing up the Constitution, don't legalize slavery. But if slavery hadn't been legalized, the South, which depended on slavery, would not join. And the only way that the South would join is if they could continue slavery. It was their economy, based their economy. And the Constitution says, okay, we will allow this. It doesn't even use the word slavery. It's so shameful. It just says that some people will only count as three-fifths of a human being. Those are black people who are slaves. And it says, we will deal with this question in 20 years after 1787. 20 years came, 20 years left, nothing happened. What finally ended slavery was not reasoned argument. like I've been urging you to take here. It was violence. It was ended by war, because eventually the compromise was, for every slave state that joined the Union, America is expanding, you have one non-slave. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected, several states said, we're not going to get our equality with non-slave states, therefore we're going to leave. Abraham Lincoln said, as I read the Constitution, you have no right to leave. The South formed an army, the North had an army. The South tried to destroy the North. The South tried to destroy the United States. It was a war of brother against brother. More Americans died in that war than all other wars that Americans have been involved in. And the issue of slavery finally was settled because of the fact of the North winning a war. The worst possible way is through violence. And then, even then we have 3 amendments added to the Constitution. One, the 13th, says no slavery. The 14th says all American citizens are equal. We don't have a second American citizenship. That's the law. And the law in America was ignored for 100 years. For 100 years, the 14th Amendment meant nothing. It's called Jim Crow. Black men, women, and children were treated as inferior systematically. And it wasn't until the civil rights movement, starts earlier, but especially in the 50s and 1960s, that the government, this is where the government did something good under Lyndon Johnson, said we need to make the 14th Amendment real. We need to have additional laws that prevent the discrimination. For example, you cannot have a hotel and say whites only. That's illegal. We're still fighting this battle, by the way. One idea. I'm going to come to my end, so don't worry. But I wouldn't be a professor if I didn't like to talk, I suppose. And that is that affirmative action. Because I just said, it's very wonderful to look in a classroom and I see 50% women, or in this case, maybe 70% women. But in any case, in America, I'm in Texas. I teach at a public university. In Texas, if I teach at a public university, the student body should look something like the state of Texas, at least at the undergraduate level. At the state of Texas, 13% are African Americans. At my university, 5%. The university is trying to get more black students. It's not easy to solve the problems of racism that begins in 1692. But finally, we have a decision that we can use what's called affirmative action and so forth. And we've had it since 1973. And we have made some progress. Until now, because the Supreme Court, with 3 justices nominated by Donald Trump, has overturned the right to affirmative action. We can't do affirmative action anymore. We're trying so hard to improve the representation of Black Americans, and now we're getting undercut. The same thing with a woman's right to abortion in America, which we had since the early 70s, has been taken away. It's politics that is killing America. Politics also at the level of judges. It's this is my final word. So I speak as a political scientist, and I have 2 propositions about politics. 2 propositions. Number 1, we humans cannot live without politics. We have to do politics to organize our society. Number 2, we're really bad at politics. We are really bad at politics. Sometimes a little better, sometimes worse, but we're not good. We humans are not good at politics. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Greg, for the amazing lecture. It has really enlightened all of us to hear the lecture from you and to see the medical aspect from bioethics perspective. And thank you so much for all the audience for the enthusiasm. I know there are still a lot of questions that haven't been asked. And I'm sorry because of the limited time. And before we end the session, we will have a photo session. Yes. I'm sorry, but unfortunately, before that, can you give us some closing statements regarding this lecture?
Closing statements regarding my lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, I really want to encourage you as future physicians to always learn about bioethical perspectives and think about how you can provide even better medical care when you take some bioethical positions into account. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to encourage you as future physicians to participate in your society with your voices as physicians, advising and making your position clear to the general public and to the politicians and to private industry and so forth, the considered position of physicians on issues that where societal issues will affect the practice of medicine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we will end the session, but before that, we will have the photo sessions for Dr. Yuni and all the participants. We will have a photo. Oh, yeah. Buat teman-teman yang mau berdiri boleh ya supaya kelihatan semuanya. Mungkin yang depan-depan duduk, yang belakang-belakang berdiri. Ya, boleh buka masker juga teman-teman supaya kelihatan wajahnya. Yeay, bebas pandemi.
You see, my sense is that people in Bandung are unusually attractive. And I just think it would be lovely to capture your beautiful faces.
Yuk boleh yang belakang berdiri biar kelihatan. Jangan lupa nanti absen tapi kita foto dulu. Satu, dua, tiga.
Oke, one more. Seperti apa itu?
Ada gaya FK Unpad gak? Masih Unite gak? Oke, masih. Unite ya. Satu, dua, tiga. Yes, now.
And students, one last thing. I just want to say that I really am very impressed that you come to this lecture in a foreign language in your own country and you listen to me for 2.5 hours. Either you are extremely kind and eager for knowledge, or you're sadists. But thank you so much. I'm really impressed. You must be wonderful, wonderful people.
Thank you so much. Once again, let's give a biggest applause for Professor Benjamin Gregg. Yes, okay, so the session is over. Ya, boleh.
Yours is a lot fancier than mine.
Nuhun. Hatur nuhun Teh Tasya. Yang lain boleh meninggalkan tempat. Terima kasih banyak.